Hello, everybody. It's great to see people again. I see my brother. Hello, Dave. Eve, Carol, everybody. Courtney and Dion. Hello. So welcome to the meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers for Thursday, August 19th, I believe it is. August 19th, 2021. For tonight's meeting, we're going to be talking about birding by ear. But as I was just discussing with our co-hosts, it's not going to be a really thorough coverage of birding by ear as a topic. It's more going to be some little bunny hops through the topic where I talk about a few specific things that are interesting to me right now. So it'll be a little less, maybe a little more in depth on a few narrow areas rather than a broad birding by ear discussion, but that should be fun. So your co-hosts are going to be Tom Bellied, who is in the Zoom. You can see him there with his Carpinteria Living Shoreline Festival t-shirt. Thank you, Tom, for representing the festival merchandise. And Laurel Luby, who is somewhere at Tom's end. Haven't seen her yet. And Jenny Slaughter, who is here, but her camera is off. She is around. So I had issued an invitation to Hugh Ranson, a local Santa Barbara birder, who I am a big fan of. And he was going to show up and participate, but he's also been very busy. He's starting up in a new classroom at a different school. He is a primary grades teacher up in, I think, Bellied. Anyway, so he was going to try to make it. He may still show up, but we will soldier on without him because he does not appear to be here as of yet. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and just hit the admit all button to let all these latecomers join. So we'll get everyone in here. And so how's everybody doing? Have people been out birding? I see waves, I see thumbs, that's always good. It is an interesting time. You know, we're again coming out of the summer doldrums. I say this every time around this time of year. We're coming out of the sort of slower birding time during the summer and getting into the fall post-breeding dispersal when just anything could show up in your yard. And there's Hugh. Hello, Hugh. So you're currently muted. So I'm going to ask you to unmute.
There we go. Hi, John.
Yeah, hi. So I already did a little, bit of an intro. Just the last little bit of sort of boilerplate information for the top of the meeting. Please keep yourself muted when you're not actually speaking. That helps make it not so distracting. But also, feel free to unmute and ask a question. You can raise your hand using the hand raise feature in Zoom or by waving at the screen. But there's enough people here today that it's a very good chance I won't see you waving a hand at the screen. So, if you have I'll try and stop periodically for questions and let you know that that's what we're receiving at that point. But it's also okay to just, unmute and say, excuse me, I have a question. And then we can handle your question. And if it gets out of control, I'll scold you and we'll clamp down. But I think for now we can go with the relaxed version of the rules. So again, greetings everyone, and especially to Hugh, special guest. I was just mentioning that I know you have started up at a new school recently, so you were being busy and you didn't know if you'd have time to make a meeting, but I'm really glad to see that you made time to show up for the meeting. Could I maybe bug you right off the top, Hugh, and ask you to just give a very brief kind of thumbnail of your history as a birder, just who you are and why people might be interested in hearing your thoughts on birds and birding?
I've been birding now for nearly half a century. I started in my native England when I was 12 years old. Got into it deeply, very quickly, and moved to California, Santa Barbara in particular, when I was 20. And I've been pretty much actively birding around Santa Barbara ever since. So that's about 40 years here in Santa Barbara.
And I think you mentioned, when you were telling me about your history, that, when you arrived in Santa Barbara, some of the first people you ran into were it was Paul Lehman and John Dunn. Is that right?
Yeah, I actually spent my first 3 or 4 nights in the United States sleeping on their couch. I'd written to them ahead of time, to Paul, and sort of finagled an invitation to come stay with them. And I moved from their couch out to Isla Vista, and been around ever since.
Well,
so that was a great introduction to Santa Barbara birding. What a great jump start into what it's all about.
And that was, I want to say that was back around like 1980-ish or the 1980s.
1981. Yeah.
So that was kind of the time when they were really putting Santa Barbara on the map birding wise. Like they were, Paul was working on his Santa Barbara bird, thesis, and John Dunn, obviously was going to go on to do great things.
They squabbled quite a bit too.
Really? About birds or just in general?
Oh, just they were roommates, so they just squabbled like roommates do.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of along with being very interested in birds, I'm also sort of a bird watcher groupie, and I always want to know like the details of what prominent birders are like in their off hours. So I probably would have really enjoyed kind of eavesdropping on that. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we'll just jump into the official topic, which is birding by ear. Again, with the caveat that it's not really a broad coverage of birding by ear. It's just a few topics about birding by ear, and we'll talk about that. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in order to begin that process. Let's see if I can do this correctly. I get out of practice with the Zoom procedure, especially this time when, I apologize after the fact for having missed the meeting last month. I just kind of flaked out and didn't have anything ready at the right time. All right, let's do that. All right, if I've done this correctly, you should be seeing my presentation. All right, so give me a thumbs up if you can see the house wren there. Excellent. Okay, so birding by ear, why and how is my sort of cheesy subtitle. There's a lot of reasons why one might want to bird by ear. It is my sense that as I've gained experience as a birder, that I rely on my birding by ear skills more and more. That, at this point, if I had to choose between birding with a blindfold on and birding with earplugs in, it depends on the habitat, but I might go with the blindfold over the earplugs, because I think my list of species would be longer if I did it just based with what I could hear versus just what I could see. And there's a few exceptions to that, like, if you're at a mud flat and there's a bunch of shorebirds way off in the distance, you're not typically going to hear much from them. But certainly in like forested habitat or in the chaparral or just lots of places, in sort of general birding, what you can hear is a very useful set of clues for your identifications. So that's, just as a practical reason, birding by ear is a very useful thing. But I also just really like listening to birds. So I wanted to share this video. This is a video I took, and I've muted it, so it's not really doing what it needs to do. Let's try again. So this was an obliging house wren that was near the entrance to Toro Canyon Park. This is a reminder to me to mention that this Saturday, so in 2 days, we're going to have another outing of Carpinteria Birdwatchers, and everyone is welcome to come. This will be at 8 a.m. at Toro Canyon Park, and there's a decent chance we'll hear that song. I mean, it's not really the singing time of year as much now, but those house wrens are pretty vocal, and you can probably hear one there. And so that's kind of my personal answer to the why question is, it's just very cool. I just like listening to birds vocalize. I think it's really neat. So Tom is mentioning in chat that he received a question about the snowy plovers. And, usually I do a bit at the top of the meeting where we kind of do Q&A or follow-ups on previous things. Tom, did you want to share that question? You're muted currently. There you go.
Because I was gone for so long, I don't know what happened to the snowy plover.
Oh, yeah, I'd be happy to update you. So as those of you who've been to these meetings before know, for much of the last summer, I was obsessed, and that meant the Carpinteria Birdwatchers meetings were obsessed with the status of the pair of snowy plovers that nested at Carpinteria State Beach by the campground. It's the first time in 60 years that there was a successful nesting of that species at that location, so it was very exciting. And in fact, it got a little bit fuzzy on the details towards the end of the fledging process, as tends to happen with these birds. They grew up and then suddenly they're gone, and you don't really know where they went or what happened to them. But the 3 chicks made it at least to around, I think it was day 29 after hatching. And then the following day, there were only 2 chicks present. So you can interpret that, however you choose. If you're an optimist, if you're a glass half full, a plover fan, you're like, well, it left. They were taking short flights as of that point. It hopefully just flew away and is happily living out its life somewhere else. And then about 2 days after that, the remaining 3 birds, the adult male and the other 2 chicks, they also vanished. And again, I'd like to believe that means they successfully fledged. I mean, that is the window during which they're known to kind of start flying around. So they flew off to other places, and hopefully we'll see more snowy plovers there next year. That is the update. Okay, so let's see. I was talking about the house wren and its singing. Let's see, we got someone else I will admit from the waiting room. Let's keep on going. How can I do that? Yeah, here we go. So as I said, this meeting is going to talk about just a few things about birding by ear. So I've divided it into 3 sections. There's the basics, which sort of a grab bag. I wanted to talk a little bit about ethics and the use of especially recorded bird vocalizations to influence bird behavior, to attract birds, and just sort of have a discussion. I'm not looking to scold anyone or promote any particular approach, but I'd be happy to share my views about it. And I think it's an interesting topic, so I'm going to talk about that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the new sound ID feature that is bundled into the Merlin app from Cornell. And this was what I guess first got me thinking about asking Hugh if you'd be part of this meeting, because you had, one of the things Hugh does, and I didn't mention this before, is you write a regular column in the Independent about birds and birding, and I highly recommend it. I encourage everyone to seek it out and read it because it's some great stuff. And you actually talked about this this app and this sound ID feature in the app, and I really like what you said, so I was going to maybe pester you to recapitulate some of that when we get to that part of the meeting. But you are welcome, even more so than everybody else, to jump in at any time and offer your thoughts. And if you're too shy about that, I'll start, asking you explicitly. But we'll see how that goes. So any questions about the subject matter, what we're going to be talking about? Here's your opportunity, anyone, to unmute and let us know. Okay, so hearing no questions, we'll move on. So part 1, the basics. Let's see. So if you want, so as I already said, it's very useful to be able to recognize the birds that you hear when you're out there. And the most direct and I think fundamentally best way to do that is to hear a bird vocalizing that you don't recognize and seek it out until you can see it and identify it visually, and then you will know. And that process will help sort of cement that in your mind. But it can be very useful to have a way of recording what vocalization went with what bird, just to kind of help you organize your thoughts and remember these things. And to do that, you need to represent those vocalizations. And there's different ways you can do that. So I wanted to talk about those. I also wanted to share this comic because I really like the False Knees webcomic. This is a bird-related online comic strip from Joshua Barkman. And one of the things I love about his comics is his birds are recognizably birds, like they're recognizably specific birds. They're not generic birds. He is clearly a bird watcher of some sort, and it factors into his comics. And I like this one because it sort of addresses, in a way, this issue of how do you represent the vocalizations that birds make. And I don't know, I just also thought it was cute, the sort of staring at the camera, Junko in the last frame, just like, this crow is annoying me and covering up my beautiful sound, but let's move on and talk about this. Oh, so I am going to play a recording of this bird. We're basically going to recreate that comic. And this is a dark-eyed junco. And this is a recording of the dark-eyed junco that was made by someone named Jeremy Minns. And I got this from xenocanto.org, which is a wonderful website with many thousands of bird recordings. And you can go, pick a species and go listen to recordings from all over its range, that species range. And anyway, here is a recording of that species. So the familiar song of the dark-eyed junco. And just to make sure I've shared my audio correctly, are you guys hearing the dark-eyed junco? Yeah, nods and thumbs.
Yes.
Excellent.
If I could jump in and
please
talk about the song of the dark-eyed junco. They make so many different varied songs. I'm constantly thinking, oh, what's that? And it's a dark-eyed junco. And I got into an argument up on Big Pine Mountain with, not really an argument, a discussion with Mark Holmgren, who thought we were hearing an orange crown warbler because it was kind of a descending trill.
Mm-hmm.
But I said, Mark, it's not. It's a junco. You'd be surprised. They don't always sing on the same note. We never did resolve it because we never did see the bird. But
well, now I'm disappointed because that would have been exciting to hear that Mark was wrong and that you were able to kind of rub his nose in it a little bit.
I was right.
Glad to hear it. Yeah, and it's all good fun. But yeah, that's a very cool story. So if you want to remember, this is the song of the dark-eyed junco. You want to fix that in your brain. There's various ways you can do that. So Sibley, in his field guide, describes it as a short trill, averaging slower and more musical than chipping sparrow, which is great if you're very familiar with chipping sparrow. But that's one way you could approach how to, represent that vocalization. Another way is with, basically writing it out as words, right? And this is what that false knees comic was doing. So li 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 li. I guess, or la 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 la. I guess that vowel sound sort of implies a higher pitch, which is what I think you're trying to convey, as opposed to a coo of a dove, which is a lower pitch. Not sure how well that works, but it's useful. So that's, again, another approach. And then here is a sonogram, which is actually really useful. And I still remember, I think it was the Golden Field Guide. So as a kid growing up, I had the Peterson Western Field Guide, and then I got the Golden Field Guide to Birds to North America, and it had sonograms in it, and that got me very excited. I felt like the first person who discovered fire. I had this tool, this incredibly useful tool for seeing because I had been reading these descriptions like, a trill, a little slower than a chipping sparrow. I was like, I don't know what a chipping sparrow sounds like. Let me see what it sounds like. So this lets you see what a sound sounds like is the idea. And if you're not familiar with these, it's basically a graph where time is on the horizontal axis. So it's probably hard to read, but this is 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. And then pitch is the vertical axis. And it's, it's graduated in kilohertz or kilocycles. So this is 5,000 cycles a second is this pitch, and then 10,000 cycles a second up here, 10 kilohertz. And 10 kilohertz is pretty much around the upper range of what people can typically hear. So there are birds that are vocalizing, higher than that, but you're unlikely to hear them. And then as it happens, as we all age and we continue to love our birds, we find that upper register is the first to go, as hearing kind of goes the way that hearing goes, especially if you listen to too much loud music when you're younger, as some of us have done. That's where you're going to start missing out on those bird vocalizations, is up around 10 kilohertz. But this junco's right there in the middle, kind of at 5 kilohertz. And this is actually the sonogram of that recording we were just hearing. So, and you can kind of see that the relatively pure tones in a sonogram are sort of like thin lines. And these are sort of a quick descending line, and then a little tick up at the end. I'm assuming that the most prominent pitch that you're hearing is this pitch here, sort of the lower end of those. Anyway, so that's what it looks like if you see a picture of that sound. And again, it can be a little bit like, I don't know how to interpret that when you first see it. But as you gain experience with reading sonograms and listening to birds and then looking at the sonogram, it's very helpful. At least I find it very helpful just to kind of, because I'm a visual person and I get a lot of information that way. I see things about the bird's vocalization when I look at the sonogram that I don't necessarily even appreciate when I'm hearing it. And it can be, again, really interesting and useful for remembering. Okay, so let's move on to this species. And here is a recording of this species made by Thomas Megarian, also from Xenocanto. Eventually. So, there we go. All right, and so Sibley's description, the familiar full voice descending car or ka with great variety of inflection and pitch. That's one way to describe that. And then there's just writing it out. It's ka, 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 ka. And then here is its sonogram. And, initially it looks pretty similar as a sonogram, but it is quite different when you look at it. These notes, these individual syllables, I guess I'll call them, of the bird's vocalization, they cover a large range of pitches, of frequencies. They go from down fairly low, all up like from about 1 kilohertz up to about 8 kilohertz, and those sort of unmusical kind of sounds. That's what they look like in a sonogram. It's like sort of like a big, thick vertical bar showing lots of different frequencies at the same time, as opposed to these sort of thinner. And again, it's in the Junco's case, it's a little tricky because they look like they're vertical, but they're really not. If we could stretch out that timeline, you'd see that no, they're a little descending thin line and then a little uptick at the end. Anyway, is this enough about sonograms? I probably go on more about sonograms than is interesting because I think they're so cool. But those are your sonograms. Anything to add, Hugh? Have you, do you put much stock in sonograms? Do you remember coming across them as an early birder?
Never interested in them, to be honest. But now that the Merlin app that converts sounds, I know you're going to be talking about this, into sonograms. Now that has me interested. Just another word about the crows, and how varied their vocalizations can be. I mean, we're all familiar with that caw, 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 but they can make so many different strange sounds. And when I first started out, they were really puzzling to me. What is making those sounds? And then you put a face to the sound, and you never forget.
Yeah, that is definitely something I've experienced too. Just like weird little, I don't know, like little bell-like notes or just weird little strange sounds coming out of the top of a tree. Like, what is that? Then you realize, oh, it's a crow. Yeah, let's move on. So again, in the basics, and I'm not going to spend much time on this at all, but I do just want to mention this distinction between songs and calls. And it's a little bit of an arbitrary distinction. Like there are some vocalizations that you ask one person, they'll say, oh, that's its song. Another will say, no, that's a call. Or I don't. There's probably an official definition that I'm just not very conversant with. But in general, the idea is that songs are vocalizations that birds use for breeding purposes, for like advertising their territorial, location, attracting a mate or defending a territory. They tend to be longer and more complex. They tend to be more varied. They tend to be more melodious and musical. And then calls are sort of a grab bag for all the other vocalizations birds make that tend to be shorter, tend to be maybe less musical, tend to be used for different specific purposes. And we'll talk about some of those different purposes. As I say, it's a little bit arbitrary, I think, but that's kind of how at least how I use the term and how I hear other people using those terms. So here is a recording of that bird on the left. This recording was made by Thomas Megarian, the same one who made our crow recording. Just a couple of different individuals of that species there, one close and one far away. And that is, of course, a song sparrow. And here is a call of that species on the right. This was made by Stanislaus Rosa. And this is the flight call of a red knot. And I wanted to include that one because not the bird you were hearing, that was a recording made in Europe, but this bird pictured in the lower right, it's a very poor photo, for which I apologize, but I wanted to include it because it's my photo. And I actually heard this bird making that flight call as I was bird watching a month or so ago up at the Santa Maria River estuary. And, seeing lots of different shorebirds and having a great time, but then heard this call and didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't something I was really familiar with. So that got me to put my binoculars on the bird and see that it was interesting. And I grabbed my camera and got these photos and was eventually able to figure out that this was a red knot, which was exciting for me because it was the first red knot I had seen this year in Santa Barbara County. And I'm weird that way that gets me excited. If I get to add one to that total, it feels like a good day. But that's basically the songs versus calls distinction. And again, I'm not really going to talk about songs so much, but it's a really fascinating topic. And this whole idea that among the North American perching birds, at least, with the exception of flycatchers, which are different, the rest of these songbirds, these perching birds that are not flycatchers, not North American tyrant flycatchers, are Oscine birds, and they actually learn their songs. The songs are not innate, so they learn it from the birds, hearing the birds around them, and they go through this really interesting process where they sort of try the song out and they make what's called subsong, and then they go through this plastic phase where they're making lots of different versions of the song, but then they sort of crystallize into their final adult form of that song. And it leads to some really interesting things that we'll talk about a little bit. But in general, again, I'm just going to move on from the whole song.
Like the northern mockingbird.
Well, that's a good example of a bird that even goes further with that, right? Where they're actually mimicking lots of other birds and other songs, so they get a great deal of variety. Yeah. And again, it's a big fun topic. Maybe we'll at a future meeting, maybe we'll talk more about it. But again, in my interest of getting to the Merlin song ID feature, I'm just going to move on from songs and talk about calls. So birds have different kinds of calls that they use for different purposes. They have what are referred to generally as contact calls, where maybe it's just a little brief vocalization that they make in the underbrush to keep in touch with another bird of their species that they're interacting with. They make flight calls, like what we heard in that red knot recording, sort of calls they make while they are in flight. And people who are really good at this can actually, during the spring and fall migrations, they can sit out at night when a lot of birds are doing their migrating, and they can just listen to these flight calls coming down, and they can tick off lots and lots of species that are traveling overhead, which I think is a really cool thing to be able to do. I cannot do it, but I admire the people who can. I don't know, Hugh, do you have any experience with identifying night flight calls during migration?
Just the kind of easier ones, like Swainson's thrushes. I was walking my dog in the wee hours last spring, and I could hear Swainson's thrushes going over. They've got a very distinctive call, but otherwise, no, I'm not so good at just the flight calls. I have heard that people at some of these migration points at, like, what is it, Point Pelee in the Great Lakes. There's birds coming off the water, just these little warblers going by, just little dots, and making calls, and birders are picking out, these very, very similar sounding birds, but they're good enough to do it. So yeah, my hat is off to them.
Yeah. And maybe with some technological help, like the Merlin Sound ID feature, maybe it'll get to the point where we could all engage in that. Just get out there with a big parabolic, listening device in the backyard and just tick them off as they go over. And then there are alarm calls. There's lots of other kinds of calls, but these are the ones I'm going to talk about. And alarm calls, I find it useful to break them down into the aerial predator alarm call versus the ground predator or perched predator alarm call. So I'll talk about those a little bit. I wanted to play show another video, which is an example of an American robin giving an aerial predator alarm call. And this is, well, I'll just play it first, then we can talk about it. So I just find that really interesting. And again, a lot of different bird species have a similar version of that aerial predator call. It's very high pitched. Sometimes it's got like a trill to it, or it's just like in this case, just a single thin kind of high note. And it tends to be, I mean, the opinion I have read that I assume makes sense, I don't know for sure if this is true, is that it's very hard to localize. So it's a sound that allows a bird to alert other birds in the vicinity that, oh, there is an aerial predator, there's a hawk flying over, without necessarily giving away its own location to that predator. So they can make that noise. And what I have certainly noticed, and what I think a lot of experienced birders have noticed, is that if you are out in a brushy landscape, there will be times when you will hear a sudden outburst of these kinds of calls all around you, these very high-pitched kind of twittering calls coming from 4 or 5 different locations in the brush around you. And when you hear that, you should look up because, more often than not, when I hear that and I look up, there is a hawk flying over. There's a Cooper's hawk or a red-tailed hawk or something coming by, and the birds are alerting each other to the presence of this threat from above. Anyway, I thought that was cool. Let's move on. And then another kind of alarm call is what I'm going to refer to as a mobbing recruitment call, which is sort of the opposite scenario. This is where the birds have found a perched predator, like a hawk or an owl in a tree, or there's maybe a cat that's on the ground. And, I don't want to claim too much in terms of my ability to analyze the psychology of the birds giving these alarms, but my interpretation of it is that this is a situation where they see if the bird has found a predator, and it's not really a threat as long as they know where it is, right? As long as it's not going to catch them by surprise, it can't get them. They can keep themselves safe from it. So they have an interest in letting all the other birds in the neighborhood know about it, and they will actually get together and make these multiple species mobs where they will bother the predator and try and drive it out of the area so they can go back to foraging or doing whatever it was they were doing when they didn't have to keep their eye on this predator. So here's another example where there's multiple species mobbing this eastern screech owl. Oops, maybe not. Let's try that again. There's something just very comical to me about the little birds, songbirds buzzing this screech owl. So, so I talk about, again, this is useful as a bird watcher. If you hear that kind of mobbing behavior, those vocalizations were different, but they weren't those really high pitched, aerial predator alarm notes. They were more lower pitched. They're more easily localized, right? And that's, I would assume, the point of those calls. Like if you want to recruit other members of your birding mob to help drive away this predator, they need to know where you are. You're calling attention to this location. You're not trying to hide your own location. So you make these more easily localized calls. And if you hear a burst of these kinds of this kind of mobbing behavior, it's always good to check it out, because a lot of times you'll see an owl that way or some other perched predator that can be very cool to see. Okay, so moving along, and yeah, I need to pick up the pace if we're going to get where we need to get. I want to bring up some complicating factors. So these are things that you should bear in mind that make it harder to just go out there and tick off all the species you're hearing. Like even if you've spent some time and effort to learn these birds and their vocalizations, there are things that make it harder. And one is repertoire. So birds, as Hugh was talking earlier, they will make lots of different sounds. Like the same species can have, a dozen different vocalizations in some cases that it makes, and you need to learn all of them if you want to reliably identify that bird from hearing it. And then beyond that, there's also individual variation, especially in these Aussie songbirds that learn their songs. Some individual birds just have a different version of the song than the one next to it. So you need to learn, not just what does one of those songs sound like, but what's the range of possibilities that are all kind of, that you can group together as, oh, that is song sparrow, or that is, orange-crowned warbler versus dark-eyed junco. You really need to you need to gain enough experience to kind of know where that plot is. If you put all the individual differences of all the different individual birds, where is the overlap? Where is, when you hear one, is it this, is it that? And that can be tricky. Regional variation, again, with the Aussie birds that learn their songs, you find there are sort of local accents, local dialects. Like a common yellowthroat song in Southern California sounds different than a common yellowthroat in Texas, which sounds different than a common yellowthroat song in Florida. So that makes things more complicated. And then Brody brought this up, mimicry, right? So Northern Mockingbird is a good example. It imitates lots of other birds. So you need to learn, not just to pick out, oh, that's a robin. You're like, well, wait a second, that's a robin, and now it's a scrub jay, and now it's a car alarm. I mean, you quickly say, oh, the fact that it varies so frequently is kind of a dead giveaway that you're listening to a mockingbird. But again, you need to learn that. And something that will trip you up, or trips me up at least from time to time, is there are some birds that are really good at imitating. Like the good example of that is the Steller's jay, that does a really wonderful red-tailed hawk impression. And it sounds like the scream of a red-tailed hawk. And I have been out in habitat where both Steller's jays and red-tailed hawks were, and confidently put down red-tailed hawk in my checklist from hearing what I thought was a red-tailed hawk, and then realizing subsequently, oh no, that was a Steller's jay doing a very good impression of a red-tailed hawk. So this can trip you up as well. And that brings me to my last point, which is, to me, the most dangerous thing about identifying a bird based on hearing it is you really just have that one line of evidence. You have that one piece of information, and you don't have separate independent pieces of information that you can use to confirm that identification. If you're visually identifying a bird and it's a tricky ID, like maybe you're not quite sure, but you at least know, oh, this was a bird the size of a Steller's jay. This was not a bird the size of a red-tailed hawk. Like even just at a broad level, you get multiple things you can put together. You can see how it flies. You can, see how it's behaving. But if you're going just based on hearing it, it is easy to get tripped up, because so it really pays, especially as you're gaining experience, to try to check your work as best you can. When you think you've heard a bird and identified it, if you can, get a look at it and confirm it. So any advice to add to that, Hugh, or does that square with your experience?
Yeah. I once heard somebody say about counting things that you've heard. Don't count it just the first time you've heard it. And I think it's good advice, because you can mishear all kinds of things on the, somebody closing their door, or the squealing springs on a door. You can misinterpret all kinds of things, but if you hear it again a second time and then a third time, then you can be a lot more sure of what it is. So that's kind of my philosophy, is don't just rely on just one quick call. Wait for it to call again. Yeah,
that's excellent advice. I thought that to myself too. And Yeah, I mean, and when you're, especially when it's dim, like you're barely hearing, it's like at the edge of your ability to perceive it and identify it. I find that's when my brain can really trip me up. You know, it's like, oh yeah, I just heard a so and so, and then you hear it better, and you realize, oh no, that's not anything like a so and so. You know, that's something else. Okay, and I just wanted to quickly just mention some resources that I really like for accessing bird recordings and learning more about them. These days, field guide apps on your phone will almost always have a good selection of bird vocalizations that you can listen to, which is very helpful. A book that I meant to have with me so I could wave it at the screen, and I forgot to do that, but it's a great book. I highly recommend it. Is the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds of Western North America. I mean, there's also an Eastern edition that came out first, but now we have the Western edition, which is great, by Nathan Piplo, not sure how to pronounce his name. Anyway, it's a great book. I really highly recommend it. PetersonBirdSounds.com is the companion site for that field guide, and it has actual copies of all the recordings that are mentioned in the field guide. And it's just, again, I don't want to spend too much time going on and on about it, but it does, what I find it does a really great job of is for any species, it gives you an idea, not just of one or two vocalizations that are most typical of it, which is what you typically will get from a conventional field guide, but he will go through all the vocalizations that bird is known to make. If it's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, they'll all be there with recordings you can access on this Peterson Bird Sounds site with sonograms. They'll talk about the circumstances in which they make them. It's really, really great stuff. Earbirding.com is Piplo's blog, where he has more interesting information about birding by ear. Xenocanto.org, I've talked about a bunch. That's, again, a website with many thousands of contributed recordings from all over the world. So it's a great place to listen to examples of these different vocalizations. And then the Merlin app, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which has its new Sound ID feature. Any bird sound resources you want to mention, Hugh, that are not on the list that you find particularly useful?
No, I just really like having Sibley on my phone and just having, you know, instant access wherever I am to listen to what's what. So that's what I use a lot.
Yeah, I do too. Okay, well, that concludes part 1. That was your basics discussion. Now we're going to go on to talking about ethics. And as a way to lead into this, I wanted to show part of a video. This is a short documentary you can watch on YouTube. There are links to this, as there are links to just all the things I'm talking about in the notes for this meeting at carpbirdwatchers.org, and also in the description for the YouTube video where the live stream will be archived. So if you're watching this later after the meeting, the description of that video will have links to these things. I'm not going to show this whole thing, but it's a really interesting documentary that I liked a lot. So I'm just going to start and run this for 3 or 4 minutes if people are okay with that. Object now if you find that objectionable. Don't object. We're just going to watch it.
May is like the prime time that birders come out to look for birds. You know, the weather is warming up, so we're getting southern air coming up, and in that air, besides all the trucks coming up from southern Manhattan, are migrant birds coming up from the tropics. For birders, you come out to the park every day to see migrant birds, to add to your life list, your year list, your county list. That's the goal. Morning. Hi. Okay. First call I play is a Virio alarm call. So what I'm telling birds with this is there's a problem. There's a cat around, there's an owl around, or some idiot with a red hat, and the Virio has found it, and he starts making an alarm call. We want other birds to come in, investigate. I just heard a little chip over here. See how close they'll come in if I use these alarm calls? They're trying to figure out where the problem is. And they look around, they'll be here for about a minute, and then they go back to doing what they were doing. Oh, wow. Oh, Tennessee Warbler. Tennessee Warbler with a wing bar. He's up here. Hi. Very greenish with a gray head. See the parallel? Let me move the location of the tape over here. He might drop down here. The electronic calls that I use, most people would try to identify birds with them, like a field guide. Oh, see the red start? See how he's looking around, trying to figure out where the sound is? I just took it one step further. For me, it's like fishing, okay? I go out there with an audio lure. That's the beauty of technology. It's designed for one thing, and then it gets out into the world, and people creatively use it in other ways, you know? It's good for business. You got a red light. What are you doing? Like I always say, if you're going to get hit by...
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Again, I really liked this documentary a lot. I encourage you to go check it out. It's, 15 and a half minutes long, so I'm not going to show the whole thing in this meeting. But this was enough to kind of lead into the discussion I wanted to have around the ethics of using playback and a discussion of how that works. That's the story of Birding Bob, who is a fixture at Central Park. Oops, no, I don't want to show it again. I want to advance to the next one. Okay, so as I think about things like using playback as a way to attract birds, and he demonstrated very well how that can be done. I think it's important to the extent you want to be considerate of the birds themselves and the other birders around you. It's important to realize that there is a range of impacts that you can choose to bird in different ways. And those different ways will have different levels of impact. And so, like at the lowest level, you can just stay home, right? Like if I want to just look at the photos that have been uploaded to the eBird site from Santa Barbara County for the day, I can have a birding experience of sorts without needing to bother the birds at all. But also, it's not a very fun experience compared to actual birding. But that's that end of the spectrum. And then you can bird sort of passively, quietly, by yourself, and try and minimize your disturbance of the birds. You can bird more actively, more noisily in groups. We're talking about going out on Saturday as a group at Toro Canyon Park. We will have more of an impact on the birds because there's a whole bunch of people walking around. And then, so another level up from that is where I would put pishing. So, I didn't talk about it so far, but it's an interesting idea. This is, the imitation. Basically, it's imitating a mobbing recruitment call. It's this kind of noise that you can make to try and encourage birds to come out where you can see them, to try and get them to respond. I have pished in the past. I am not claiming any, moral high ground of not pishing. Although the fact is, I have tended to pish less in recent years, and in fact, probably don't do it much at all these days. But there are other birders whom I respect and admire who pish all the time, and it's a thing. I think one of the reasons why I have tended not to do it is that I'm not very good at it. And listening to, there was a podcast that Nate Swick with the American Birding Association has a really great podcast, the American Birding Podcast, where in a recent one, he talked about pishing, and he is a very accomplished pisher. And his advice about pishing is, well, what you want to do is you want to make a good imitation of an alarm call of a bird that's actually present in that environment. And I think this is something I've done poorly. Like I'm out there just sort of generically, and the birds are not fooled because it doesn't really sound like a bird that's around. But what Nate suggests is, oh, no, do an alarm call of like a black-capped chickadee or he's birding, and specifically do that call, and it will be more effective for fishing purposes. We were mentioning Mark Holmgren earlier. Mark Holmgren I have seen do very effective fishing where he combines the fishing sound with a very good imitation of a Western screech owl. So this is just like catnip, right? This will pull the birds out because they hear a Western screech owl and they hear a mobbing recruitment call, and they're like, okay, I got to get in on that. Anyway, that's fishing. Another step up from that, and if you take what you're trying to do effective fishing to its next logical step, well, you could use playback. You use a recording of an alarm call of a bird that's actually in that habitat. And then if you want to take it up a notch from there, you have amplified playback with an external Bluetooth speaker, like you saw Birding Bob doing in that clip. So, again, I'm not pronouncing a moral judgment on these behaviors. I have engaged in all of these behaviors myself at some point. But I do think it's worth thinking about in terms of thinking about the impact that we have on the birds that we're interacting with. I don't know. Again, I'm very sensitive that I don't want to offend people. I don't want to be telling people that, oh, no, you're doing it wrong. But, we're all doing it differently. We're all doing it as best we can. We all are enjoying birds in our own way. I don't know. I'm interested, Hugh, in your take on this. I don't think I've actually birded with you in a context where pitching would have been involved or playback would have been involved. I'm curious what your take is on this topic.
Yeah, I'm not really a purist on this, but I do agree with your impact sort of line here, and I'd say I'm much less impactful than I used to be. I'd say in my younger days, in my eagerness to try and see as much and as many species as possible, I would pish all the time and get birds coming. And I don't really do it very much. Something I really want to try and see. Playback is something I haven't really had the technology to do. I've only just recently got a smartphone, so I only recently had the ability to. And I have done it now and again. Like, for example, when I was out in the sagebrush desert this summer, and I wanted to see if there were any sagebrush sparrows out there. And so I played the song a couple of times, and bird came zooming in to check me out. And I didn't feel too bad about that one because, the birds make a pretty good living out there, and they're not having too many people doing it. I think that's a factor. If you're in an area where there's very few birders going to be around putting stress on birds, I think judicious playback is less harmful. On the other hand, that you can have places that are very heavily birded where it's going to impact the birds greatly. I just read today there's up in Sonoma County, there's a very rare bird that's usually just found in southeast Arizona called the Sulphur bellied Flycatcher. And there's been one up there for several days, and they're notoriously very difficult to see. And they're very quiet away from their breeding grounds. And this one is obviously well away from its breeding grounds. It's kind of a lost vagrant, as they say. And apparently a lot of birders have been up there just, using a lot of playback, trying to lure it out from the deep within the bushes. And not only does that probably have an effect on the bird, but also probably on the chances of other birders getting to see it too. So I think there can be a little bit of selfishness involved with the whole playback thing.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that the number of people and the rarity of the bird, and when those two kind of amplify each other, right? You've got a bird that's so rare that lots of people are showing up to try to see it. That can be a case where the sensitivities of other birders, are going to be more important to consider when you're choosing to do playback. Okay. This is actually an interesting example. You were talking about the sagebrush sparrow. So this is just, I wanted to share this story because it's an interesting thing that I look back on, and even more so than at the time when I think about it today. It was an important point in my journey towards being a less impactful birder. So I was out at Deer Park Canyon up in the northeast part of Santa Barbara County, and there were bell sparrows, close relatives of the sagebrush sparrows. And I knew they were in there. I really wanted to see one. I had not that long before this, I had bought my first, somewhat decent camera. So I was really into getting photos of the birds. So I went ahead and thought I had caught a glimpse of this bird, but I used a playback of its song. And it was very interested in this intruder in its territory. It came flying out into the open and approached closely enough for me to get this photo. And I was very pleased with myself that I had done this. And about 5 seconds after I took this photo, there was a flash of wings, and this bird flew into the same bush trying to catch that bird that I'd been photographing. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. And it did not succeed, which was, I guess, good for the sparrow, not so good for the hawk, and it departed without a sparrow. But in hindsight, I did think about the fact that, I lured that bird out into the open so that I could get a photo of it. And in doing that, I actually risked that bird's life, that it actually exposed itself in a way it would not have if it didn't think there was an intruder in its territory. That the bird makes a risk reward assessment itself when it decides whether to break concealment and come out into the open. And that's what I'm exploiting when I use playback in that way. But there's other, threats in the landscape that are perfectly willing to exploit that situation for their own purposes, as this hawk tried to do. So it just brought home to me that, who am I? I like to think that I am behaving in a way that is friendly towards the birds, and getting your friends eaten is not a very friendly thing to do. So it made me think about that. Okay, so I just want to kind of run down a little summary. There are pros and cons for this idea of attracting birds using sound. And here I'm lumping things like pitching and vocally imitating birds just with your own voice. I'm lumping it together with playback and certainly with amplified, louder playback. So the pros: it brings shy birds into view. Right? This is pretty much its whole point. It can help confirm an ID. A lot of times, if you're out birding and there's a rarity, and we're not, the people viewing it are not sure, they'll use playback of that species to see if the species reacts to it, because that will help, verify this ID that they suspect they have. So it can be useful for that. And in general, it makes your birding more efficient and more productive. And this is something that I see a lot in, like, some of the birders that I've birded with sometimes, who actually, do bird assessments professionally. They work for, biological consulting firms, and they'll go out there and do a landscape, and they will, as part of an environmental impact report, they will go and assess the bird population in a habitat. It's very important that they, if quickly and efficiently identify the species that are present, and for them to use pitching or playback, I think is, arguably justified. In some of those situations, whether or not you note that there is a species present in that habitat can be very important to, like, land use decisions. And again, it's maybe more justified than it would be if it was just for fun, just for adding a tick to the list. It can make birding more enjoyable for more people. And if you watch the rest of that video about birding Bob in Central Park, he's very popular. He leads birding groups. That's what he does. And he does it for a living. He basically charges $10 a head to come be part of his bird outings. And he produces results, and that's why he can attract those people. And, there's an ethical consideration. They're like, oh, so you're saying it doesn't bother the birds, but you're making money to hold that position. And, there's a famous saying that I don't remember the exact version of it, but it's basically, if someone can make their living believing something, it's very easy for them to believe that, in spite of, evidence that might suggest otherwise. But also, those people are enjoying those birds in a way that is probably a good thing, that they're experiencing birds, they're seeing close, exciting views of them. A lot of those people who've taken his tours probably go down the path of becoming lifelong bird watchers and birders, and they might not have done that if they didn't have such an exciting experience. Okay, but then there are cons. It can annoy or distract other birders. And again, if you go watch that, the rest of that video, there are several interviews with annoyed other birders talking about their views about birding Bob. It alters the bird's behavior, which just in and of itself could be construed as a bad thing. It makes birds expend energy and incur risk, like I was talking about with my Bell's sparrow, or in general, migrating birds. We had that big die-off last fall, where a bunch of the migrants in the Southwest just, it'd been a tough year for insects, and they had a sudden cold snap during the migration, and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of birds died. So for birds, this whole energy budget is sometimes a life or death thing. For them to spend even a little bit of extra energy to come out and investigate some annoying person playing sounds off their phone could have a life or death consequence. And one particular thing that I had heard about years ago, and is definitely a concern, for people who are really into owls, using recorded playback to get owls to respond is a really common way to try and assess the presence of owls in a landscape. And certain kinds of owls, certain times of year, certain situations, using playback can actually scare them away. Like they will decide that there's a rival in the area that is a risk to them, like because owls will attack each other, and decide to leave a roost site for some other site just because they've heard a lot of playback. Yeah, Brody, I see you've got your hand up. Did you have a question or a comment?
I just was wondering, would it affect barn owls or great horned owls?
So my understanding is that barn owls and great horned owls are not as sensitive in that way as long-eared owls. They're certainly much more common. They're much more habituated to people. They tend to show up around human residences. I'm not an expert, but my sense is that, again, as with that range of impacts from different kinds of birding, different bird species have different levels of sensitivity.
Yeah, because I play those all the time, and I get so many barn owls and great horned owls to show up. It's awesome.
Yeah, it is awesome, and it's I don't want to discount the fun of seeing a bird up close. As I say, I have done these things myself. The main point I'm trying to get across here is just maybe to be aware, to be mindful of it, to think about it, and if you choose to conduct your birding in a way that is less impactful, that might be a good thing to do going forward if you can get to that place. But again, I'm not judging here. I will point out the American Birding Association has a code of birding ethics that talks about this in particular, and I've highlighted the relevant passage. They suggest that if people wish to be ethical birders, that they limit the use of recordings and other audio methods of attracting birds, particularly in heavily birded areas, for species that are rare in the area and for species that are threatened or endangered. So kind of a good summary. I think a useful position that I could certainly stand behind myself. Okay, so enough of ethics. We can discuss ethics more. If people want to discuss ethics, it'd certainly be a good time. If people want to weigh in, we'll pause here for a few seconds. Here, I'll back up to the ABA slide. Any input? Hugh, any response from your end about this sort of larger ethical question?
No, I think you've hit all the main points, and you've struck the right tone there. It's it's obviously up to each individual. We've some people put the birds first, and some people put their lifeless first, and some people are somewhere in the middle. So I think it's an individual thing, but it's something we need to consider carefully.
Yeah, and it's an evolving thing too. If you go back to early ornithologists in North America, they identified birds along the barrel of a shotgun. That was how you birded, was you killed them in order to see what they were. And I'd like to think that we are more enlightened now in our approach to birding, but it's a spectrum. It's an ongoing process and an evolution about the relationship between me as a birder and this object of my interest. It's kind of interesting too. I know, Hugh, you're very interested in butterflies and odonts, dragonflies and damselflies. There's probably a much stronger and more recent tradition in the realm of the people who are into insects of collecting, by killing the object of their interest. It seems to me that maybe with butterflies and dragonflies and damselflies, you're actually focusing on insects that you don't necessarily have to kill in order to identify them or keep track of what you've seen. Is that, I'm again, not from a judgy perspective, but I'm just curious, do you have more experience in the world of entomology or amateur entomology that there's a different sensibility, a different attitude towards impacts on the species you're interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's very few people who actually collect dragonflies these days, but butterflies, that's a whole different ballgame. I started studying butterflies about a year ago, and I joined a website, Desert Odes, and it's fascinating just watching the back and forths on there. This website is a stronghold of people who are kind of old-fashioned collectors. They collect butterflies. That's what they do. They love their butterflies, but they collect them. their argument is that they're doing it for science. There's still a lot to be learned about butterflies, like what's a species, what's a subspecies. They're into doing a lot of DNA analysis, but they're unabashedly collectors. They will agree that collecting a species that's very rare is not the right thing to do, but they frequently talk about adding to their collections. I'm not one of them. I just watch from the sidelines and sort of amused at how passionate they are. I just take photographs. That's all I do, and try and figure it out from there. But with butterflies, there are some that you cannot identify, and therefore you cannot know what their true range is unless you are collecting them. And some of them even you just have to ID with DNA. So I can kind of see it with butterflies. I'm not going to collect them and kill them myself, but it's important to know what's found where, and so we can protect them, paradoxically.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that insight, because I've always been interested in insects, but never really got enough into it that I was involved in it in the way in terms of like making a collection, and there's obviously a strong cultural tradition there that the old school collectors are operating within. That's just how you did it. That's just what they do. Okay, well, I want to go on and talk about a really helpful tool that kind of helps us sidestep a lot of these ethical considerations, because I'm talking a lot about the impacts of sort of actively using sound to attract birds. But what the new Sound ID feature in the Merlin app does is it makes it easier than ever to passively listen to the birds around you and identify them. And I'm just a big fan of it. I think it's very cool. There have been several versions of this approach. There have been several different apps that in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years that have come along that purport to do something like this, to let you use the microphone on your phone, on your smartphone, to make a recording and analyze it to determine what species it is. But at least my limited experience with them has been that they have not been that good. They haven't been good enough to really justify the hassle of using them. But this Sound ID feature in the Merlin app is a real step forward, and probably 4 or 5 different birders out in the field over the last few months, as I've been out birding and run across people I know, have come up and said, "Oh, have you seen the Sound ID feature in the Merlin app? Have you seen the new Merlin Sound ID?" Because it's a very exciting development. So I want to talk a little bit about what they did that makes it so good. This is a screenshot that was shared in a presentation that the folks at Cornell Lab who developed this shared. And what it shows is the basic approach, and I don't want to get too much into the jargony technical side of it. I mean, I work in web development, internet development, and this whole machine learning thing is an interesting concept. But what they basically do is they have this big data set. They have a bunch of recordings, many thousands of recordings at the Macaulay Library that have been identified to species, that basically have been, labeled with, oh, this species is in this recording. And this suggests what you might do as a machine learning process is you might feed all that data into a computer and say, okay, here's a bunch of recordings, here's a bunch of identifications of what's in those recordings, figure it out, find patterns that you can use that the computer, the software can use to identify species in new recordings that were not part of that data set. And one of the things that's made this less effective until recently is that those recordings that they're trying to train their machine learning algorithm on tended to be like long recordings with lots of different birds in them. So if you've got a recording that's 45 seconds long and it's got red-winged blackbird and common yellowthroat and a brewer's blackbird and maybe a robin, if it's got all those in there and you hand it to the machine to learn from it, it can't learn very well. It can't really get very specific about what specific sounds in there go with what specific species. So what they did for this Merlin Sound ID project is they used an intermediate step. And this is a screenshot of the tool they used to do that, where they basically took a whole bunch of expert birders and they had them analyze a whole bunch of recordings and not just indicate, oh, these species are in this recording, but to actually draw on the sonogram and say, oh no, this part is the marsh wren and this part is the black tern or whatever. I mean, I'm not sure that's even correct in this case, but they went through and they labeled, in many thousands of recordings, labeled the specific parts of the recording that went with which species. And then that was the training data that they fed to the machine learning algorithm. And it was a success. It allowed them to get an accurate enough version of it that what they ended up with is really pretty spectacularly good in my opinion, when you go out and try and use it in the field. And it's not perfect. There is, and they talk about this in that same video I was talking about, that same discussion they had about the development of it. What they end up with is a plot of certainty. Like they have a dial. They can say, okay, how aggressive do we want to be in assigning these IDs? And if they turn the dial way down, they can be very sure that, oh, we're only identifying things that have a very high probability of being correct, but they only identify a small number of things. And conversely, they could turn the dial way up and be very aggressive, and identify lots of things, but they'd be wrong a lot of the time. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to find that optimal point where they identify a lot of what's in there without too many mistakes, but they're willing to allow some mistakes in the interest of doing more identification. And, my sense from just using it a few times in the field is if you're in a landscape where the birds are loud enough, and they don't have to be too loud, but they have to be pretty clearly audible. You run this Merlin Sound ID and you activate it, and it will just sit there and it will just list the birds that it's hearing. And it's like magic. It's wonderful. It's a really great tool. And because of my weird obsession with the county listing thing, I have birded a lot in Santa Barbara County over the last several years, to the point where I'm pretty confident in almost all the bird vocalizations I'm hearing in the field around here. So for me, it's not as useful as it could be, because I'm mostly looking at it being impressed at how many it's getting, right? But if I just travel a few hundred miles, I very quickly arrive at a place where I am nowhere near as confident in identifying what I'm hearing. And there, it's a really spectacular help. And I look forward to, when I do more traveling, hopefully in the near future, being able to try this out in some habitats. Tom and Laurel, your co-hosts, were just back from a trip back east, and were telling me, and I think you guys are in the meeting, right? I'd be really interested if you're willing to unmute and kind of share a little bit about your experience of using the Merlin Sound ID. Was it useful? Did it work for you?
Laurel, do you want to do that? Anyways, we were in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, which is way, way up there, right on the border of Canada. And there was a ton of warblers, all types of warblers. Some of them we were unfamiliar with, but it's very, very densely, the forest is very, very dense. So we hardly could see the birds. And the Merlin app helped us so much figure out what type of bird we were trying to find. And then when it did sneak out, we get a picture of it and verify that was a bird. So it was very, very helpful in that area. And we were in other areas of New Hampshire that didn't know the birds as well. And the Merlin app was incredibly useful. So.
Yeah. And Hugh, I know you had written about it in your column in The Independent. Did you want to offer any thoughts on it? I mean, I'm gushing about it. I don't want to just, maybe you can find something to criticize. I don't know, but I'm curious about your take on the Sound ID feature in the Merlin app.
Yeah, I went up to the Sierra Nevada, spent a month up at Mammoth this summer, and decided I was going to try out. I'm unstable, so I hope you can hear me. And I was really impressed. Some of the things that I'm as John said, I'm like him. I'm pretty confident of most of the birds I hear around here, but not so much. Get out of comfort level. So as far as that, Townsend Solitaire I can hear singing. So I turned on Merlin, and sure enough, within a second, it told me, it said, Townsend Solitaire. I found a Williamson Sapsucker Nest, and I don't know the vocalizations very much, so I wanted to see if Merlin could figure it out. And even these little soft churring calls at the nest, it just picked them up right away. And then a hairy woodpecker started calling, and it's a bird I'm very familiar with. Must have been a couple of 100 yards down a ravine, and it picked that one up and identified it right away. I'd say it was right, about 90% of the time. One of the funny things, where it got it wrong, was if you know the call of the song, I'm not sure which it is, of the saw-whet owl. It's sort of a rhythmical tooting, sort of toot, 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 toot. And as I was recording a woodpecker with Merlin, there was a truck backing up down the road, giving its backing up call, and it immediately identified it as a saw-whet owl. So it's not right 100% of the time. And getting back to those dark-eyed juncos that I said have so many crazy songs and calls that keep surprising me. There was a dark-eyed junco that was singing up in the conifer forest, and I didn't know what it was at first. It didn't sound like a typical song at all. And I could tell Merlin was kind of struggling. It kept giving different options. It called it an American Dipper, and then it called it a pine siskin, which could have been up there, but I wasn't hearing those things. So if it's a kind of an unusual species song like that junco was giving, it's going to struggle, because I think it's probably just picking up on the more typical ones. But I heartily recommend it, especially if you don't know your calls very well and your songs, because boy, it can really help to teach you about what is around where you live, and it help you put the sound to the faces that you're seeing sometimes. So I really like it. Yeah,
I endorse everything you said there. And yeah, I had the same sense too. I'd say about 90%. Like, I haven't used it that much, but that's about the percentage of misidentifications that I catch. That what was it? I was out at Toro Canyon Park, where we're going to be on Saturday, and was recording a black phoebe, and it was correctly identifying it as a black phoebe. And then one of the black phoebe calls, it flagged it as, it suggested it was a pygmy nuthatch, which is not a bird that would be expected there. But I don't, the sound, Merlin uses the eBird data to get a sense of what birds are kind of possible in the area, but I don't think it's quite as specific as what, an obsessive Santa Barbara County birder would know about what is and is not likely to be in an area. And when I went back, and you can choose to listen to the particular part of the recording that produced a suggestion when you listen to the recording later. And when I listened, I realized, oh no, that was one of the black phoebe vocalizations, and it did sound a little bit like a pygmy nuthatch that one time. But I'm also very impressed. I was going to try to do a little bit of a live demo, and I don't think I'm going to try and do much of a demo here, which is good, because live demos are famously fraught with danger in the tech world. But I'm going to go ahead and try to join the meeting from my phone, so you can kind of take a look at what the app looks like, at least. I'm not going to do something live with it, but I'll just kind of show you what the interface looks like. So to do that, and I have to talk it through, because I can't do things with tech without narrating what I'm doing. Let's see. I am going to, you know what? I did not prepare well, because I need to find the actual meeting. Let me try this. I appreciate all of your patience. This is not particularly good meeting content for me to be staring at my phone. All right. Okay, so I am in the meeting, and I'm going to try to share my screen, which, if I'm doing this correctly, will replace the screen that we've got going currently. All right, well, that was fun. Okay, so what am I looking for? I'm looking for the Merlin sound ID. So here's the Merlin app. And if you update your Merlin app to the latest version, it's going to have this sound ID button. And basically you click on that and it gives you a big green microphone. Try and get close to the bird if you can. And then just hit that green button and it will start recording. Except in this case, it can't because I don't actually have a mic connected, I guess, or I'm not sure why. Something about how I'm doing it right now, it's not happy. So instead, I will show you what it looks like when you look at a previous recording. So this is kind of a version of what you see when you're using the app. You'll have this sonogram running across the top, and in the case where you're recording, it'll be live. And then as it identifies birds that thinks it's hearing, it'll pop them up on the part below there. And when it does that, you can click this little down arrow next to a bird, and you can see other examples of its vocalization that you can play and listen to, which is helpful. See if I play. I'm not sure the audio is going to come through. Let's see if it does. Yeah, so you can kind of hear it's not very loud, but you can hear that Hutton's Virio in the background. And there's me crunching through the leaves. And some interference from my microphone. We'll talk about this later. We'll talk about this Saturday if you want. When we're at the at Toro Canyon Park, we can do a live demo of this. And I'm going to go ahead and tap on the white-breasted nuthead so it skips ahead to the place where that was. And you see those churs that it made. Okay, well, that was fun. Let's see. I'm going to now stop doing that. Well, that was somewhat successful. Anyway, that's what the Merlin Sound ID app looks like. Or the Merlin ID, the Merlin app's Sound ID feature. That's what that looks like. So if any of that sounded interesting and you haven't checked it out and you have a smartphone that you want to put it on, I encourage you to check that out. Okay. Oh, there was one more thing I did want to share. So, and Hugh, you talked about this in your column again, where you talked about this opinion piece that I really loved that was in the New York Times in late July. It was titled, "This Shazam for Birds Could Help Save Them." It's by Margaret Renkl, and again, there's a link to it in the description for this meeting. But I just really liked what she wrote, and she concludes by saying, "We are a species motivated by love. Our most powerful work is done in the fervor of love. Our most urgent effort is born from the fear of losing what we love best. To save birds, we need to make the whole human race fall in love with birds." And this is a conclusion to her discussion of this Sound ID feature in the Merlin app. Her suggestion is that by opening people's ears, by letting them hear what is actually around them, these undifferentiated bird sounds, they actually realize, oh no, let's go with specific birds and specific species. They will enter on this path of love of birds that I think all of us are at some point on that journey. And if more people, walk that path, then maybe it can make a difference for birds that certainly need all the help they can get. So anyway, I encourage you to check out that article. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, and Hugh, again, I know you had singled out that article. I'm curious if you had anything to add about it or anything from that piece that you wrote in the Independent.
Actually, I think we talked about that piece on the boat together. I hadn't actually read that, but I do share the. I had mentioned in the article that it's kind of like Shazam, in that, which I use when I'm in Trader Joe's and I want to know what song is playing, but it's I think infinitely more useful than Shazam, and I do agree that I think it can. I'm hopeful that it could help people learn about the birds around them and and care enough to want to make sure they keep living into the next century.
All right. Well, thank you. And on that somewhat hopeful note, I think I'll go ahead and conclude the discussion of birding by ear. Any final input or questions? You know, people have been very patient, just put up with me yakking on and on and on.
Can I please show 2 pictures that I've made?
Yeah, that'd be great, Brody. Now, let's see it. Now,
I just
are
have
you
to take off my background. Sorry.
okay? Oh, you're just going to hold them up. Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's easy for me. Wow.
So this one's supposed to be in Texas. It has a bunch of different birds that I put on there. I have not traced them. I have hand done them. I look at photos and I copy them back onto here in different sizes. And then here's one in the Saguaro Desert with a bunch of different ones. Yeah.
Well, that's great, Brody. And you know, trying to, you know, drawing the birds yourself or illustrating them yourself, that is a wonderful way to learn more about them. That definitely will help you advance even faster.
But yeah, it's really fun doing it.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for sharing those. How are your ducks and chickens doing?
My ducks are almost full grown. The male mallards have already been starting to get their glossy head feathers, which is really cool. And the pekin ducks are like 8 or 9 pounds.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
a big duck.
And my chicks are still only about this big, I'd say. Sorry, I can't really see how big that is, but they're about the size of a pizza.
Okay.
Let's just say that. I don't know how to do it because that's what I just ate for dinner. So that's what I can think of.
Okay. Well, thanks, Brody.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
It's really fun. Yeah.
Okay. Any other input from anyone? We're a little over. We're about 90 minutes, which is not terrible. I always try and make them shorter, and I always fail. But I appreciate those of you who stick around anyway. Okay. Well, in that case, hope to see some of you on Saturday at Toro Canyon Park. Otherwise, I'll put an update in the carpbirdwatchers.org website with our topic for next month, and I'll see you guys then. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Brody.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you, Hugh.
Thank you.